Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the interpretations and debates around Congress in A-level politics. This is the fourth video on Congress on the channel. The first went through Congress's structure, the second Congress's representative function, the third looked at Congress's legislative and oversight functions, and this is the final one that's going to look at some key debates and wrap it up. The PDF you can see on your screen, you can find on the Politics Explained website as part of an updated textbook on US government and politics. But you can also find loads of other resources to help you in your politics A-level, including essay plans and textbooks, which are constantly updated for UK politics, UK government, and the core ideologies as well as a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in. So yeah, I'm going to start by looking at the parts of specification this lesson covers, then look at some of the key questions, and then get into the content. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off with the parts of the specification this lesson covers, so it's 2.3 of the edXL specification, looking at interpretations and debates. So the changing roles and powers of Congress and their relative importance. So the debate about the adequacy of its representative role, as well as the adequacy of legislative and oversight roles, have been covered in previous videos. Also going to look at the changing significance of parties in Congress, and finally the significance and effectiveness of the powers outlined in the Constitution. In terms of key questions you could get asked, these questions all are about the whole of the Congress topic, and the content in this video will be pretty much useful for all of them. So looking at kind of comparing between Parliament and Congress, between particular houses in Parliament and particular houses in Congress, and also you could get one comparing the parties in Congress, comparing the powers in Congress with Parliament, or a particular part of Congress, so the House of Representatives with the House of Commons, for example. In terms of essay questions, exactly the same. The content here is going to be useful for pretty much all of them and how you can bring them in, especially in relation to the parties, but they'll especially be useful potentially in questions on how well Congress fulfills its roles overall. You could also get one on the kind of changing power of the parties, but as I said, they'll be useful for all of these questions, and these questions are all for all of the Congress topic. So yeah, starting off, what we're going to have a look at is the changing roles and powers of Congress and their relative importance, starting by looking at the key roles and powers of Congress. So you probably would have looked at these quite a lot already, and we covered these in the previous videos. But the first one is lawmaking. So the primary role of Congress is to create and pass legislation. This is really central to the workings of representative democracy and the means through which public will is translated into policy. So both the Senate and House of Representatives have to consent to a law before it can be passed, whilst committees play a really important role in drafting and amending legislation. Representation is another key role. As I said, we've already done a video on that. So each member of Congress represents the interests and views of their constituents, whilst Congress as a whole represents the whole of the American populace. And this is particularly important during midterm elections, where they can reflect changing national moods, and effectively they allow the nation in midterms to effectively almost, it's a little referendum on the first 2 years of the presidency. If they don't like what the president's done, they can vote for the other party, or especially if they don't like what the president's party in Congress has done as well, they can vote them out. Oversight is another key role, so Congress holds a responsibility to oversee and investigate the actions of the executive branch's agencies, doing so through hearings, investigations and reports, with committees also playing an important role. And this is really important for maintaining checks and balances within the Constitution, so ensuring the kind of accountability and transparency of the presidency. The power of the purse is another key power of Congress, so it controls federal spending through its budgetary and appropriation powers, which allow it to constrain and influence the executive's agenda whilst pursuing an agenda of its own. So Congress has the power to decide on taxation, spending and borrowing. Congress also has a key power over appointments, and this is the Senate in particular, which has the power to confirm or deny presidential appointments to key executive positions, including the cabinet and various agencies, as well as the Supreme Court and the rest of the judiciary. And this is particularly important for the Supreme Court, as they're lifetime appointments and can have really big political effects. And then finally, Congress has key foreign policy powers. So they kind of play a key role in shaping and influencing the nation's foreign policy, including the authority to declare war, regulate commerce with foreign nations, and the power to ratify treaties and confirm diplomatic appointments. That's the Senate in particular for those final two. The president is often viewed as the kind of chief architect of US foreign policy, but Congress does have substantial influence through its legislative and financial powers, so it can pass legislation that affects foreign aid, impose sanctions, and it controls military spending. And these powers kind of enable Congress to set the broad outlines of US foreign policy and have a bit of a check on the president's diplomatic initiatives. Okay. What I'll have a quick look at now is the significance of unified and divided government. I've included this because I think it's really important to understanding how the power of Congress varies in particular situations. So the power of Congress and its effectiveness in carrying out its roles is highly dependent on the balance of parties, in particular whether there's unified or divided government. So unified government is when both houses of Congress are of the same party as the presidency, whereas divided government is when one or both of them are from a different party to the presidency. So in terms of lawmaking, the dynamics of lawmaking vary significantly when there's unified versus when there's divided government. So when there's unified government, as seen in the first 2 years of Biden's presidency, it's much easier for the Senate and House of Representatives to agree on and pass legislation, such as the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which is a key COVID bill. As is often the case under divided government, the legislation aligned with the president and the governing party's agenda, and they were able to unite and pass a key piece of legislation without the need for support from the other party in Congress. Under divided government, by contrast, there's a need for a lot more compromise and negotiation between the Democrats and Republicans in order to get anything passed, which leads to more moderate compromise and watered down legislation in many cases, and sometimes or often results in legislative gridlock. So during the Trump administration, after the 2018 midterms, when there was divided government because the Democrats regained control of the House of Representatives, legislative efforts like the repeal and replacement of the Affordable Care Act faced significant hurdles and were unsuccessful due to divided government. In terms of oversight, this is really influenced by whether the government is unified or divided. So the Democrat-controlled House's scrutiny of the Trump administration, including investigations and impeachment proceedings, exemplifies how when there's divided government, there's heightened oversight. And that can be seen as really good for scrutiny. And it can be argued that Congress is more effective at oversight of divided government, but due to this, because they're more likely to effectively try and damage the president, it can be argued that actually does that result in always better oversight, or just trying to use the oversight powers of Congress to damage the president and therefore for party political gain? By contrast, the early period of the Biden administration, when there was a unified government, saw a reduced focus on executive oversight as the same party controlled Congress and the presidency, and they were working together to pass important pieces of legislation and pursue legislative goals rather than seeking to damage each other. So that shows that unified government is less likely to provide effective oversight, as they don't want to. The party isn't going to want to damage its own party and its own president. In terms of power in the purse, fiscal negotiations and decisions in Congress are massively influenced by the composition of the government and whether there's unified or divided government. So the 35-day government shutdown during the Trump administration, triggered by conflicts over border wall funding, highlights the challenges of budget agreements in a divided government. So under divided government, the exercise of power of the purse is often marked by hard negotiations with the opposition party, the presidency, and by the desire to limit their budget carrying out the president's key priorities. Under unified government, by contrast, such as early in the Biden administration, there's often a smoother passage of legislation and of budgetary measures due to this agreement and cooperation within the party between Congress, key members of Congress, in particular the Speaker of the House and the President. So it's defined a lot more by cooperation under unified government and pursuing a shared agenda. In terms of the power of appointments, the process of confirming presidential appointments, especially to the judiciary, varies also based on unified and divided government. And this can really be seen by the fact that there was a rapid confirmation of Justice Amy Coney Barrett under the Trump administration in the last couple of months of his presidency, as there was a Republican-controlled Senate. And this illustrates how smoother kind of confirmation process happened under a unified government, as effectively it doesn't matter if it wasn't actually a unified government, but the key point is that the Senate in particular was controlled by the president's party, even if the House wasn't. And that's because the Senate and the president have shared goals in electing justices that are likely to favour their policy goals. So in this case, electing a conservative justice. And this really contrasts with the failure to appoint Merrick Garland in the last couple of months of Obama's presidency. So a very similar situation, but there was a different party controlling the Senate compared to the presidency. And this showcased the challenges and contentious nature of appointments under divided government, when the Senate can use the power to try and halt the president's influence over government, and the Supreme Court in particular. And in this case, in 2016, the Senate, the Republican Senate, said they weren't appointing Garland because it was an election year, and it should be waited for, effectively they should wait for the new president to be elected. they then didn't do the same when it was in the case of Amy Coney Barrett and Trump's appointment. So it really shows how kind of party objectives and partisan politics comes into it, and the importance of who controls the Senate and whether it's the same party as the presidency. In terms of foreign policy powers, under unified government, there's often more cohesive support for the president's foreign policy agenda, leading to quicker approval of treaties and smoother confirmations of diplomatic appointments. So during the early part of the Obama administration, when the government was unified, the New START Treaty, a nuclear arms reduction agreement with Russia, was ratified, for example. However, in a divided government, foreign policy decisions can be contentious, with increased debates and scrutiny over international agreements and military engagements. So when the government is divided, treaties and international agreements face more hurdles. You can see that in the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty during the Clinton administration, which was never ratified by the Senate, partly due to the fact that there was a Republican majority. Military actions and engagements often come under intense debate and scrutiny during divided government. So during the latter part of the Trump administration, there was significant congressional debate and opposition related to military sales to Saudi Arabia and the US's role in the Yemen conflict, and that may have been less under divided government. So I kind of thought I'd first highlight the power of the importance of whether the government is unified or divided, and the particular party makeup of Congress, because I think it's effectively one of, if not the most important factor. What we're going to have a look at now is other influences on the roles and the power of Congress. So the first one is increased polarization and partisanship in US politics. So over recent decades, you've seen this increased polarization and partisanship in US society and politics, which has kind of had a profound influence on the roles and powers of Congress, altering the legislative process and the effectiveness of governance. Now, as ideological divisions between and within the major political parties have deepened, legislative gridlock has become more common, particularly in periods of divided government. So it's led to fewer bipartisan efforts and a tendency to pass significant legislation through party line votes. You'd have had a lot more unified parties, and the need to have a unified party to pass anything, because you won't get any votes from moderates from the other party. So the Affordable Care Act was passed through a complete party line vote, no Republicans voting for it, as was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed by Trump in 2017, which had no Democrats voting for it. So there's a shift towards strictly partisan voting and agendas. And this has also affected Congress's oversight function, with investigations and hearings often becoming contentious and politically charged, reflecting deeper ideological battles rather than a unified pursuit of accountability and transparency for upholding democracy, partly moved towards damaging the other party. This can also be seen in the power of the purse and the approval of appointments, especially judicial nominations, which has become focal points of partisan conflict, leading to negotiations and procedural tactics like the filibuster and budget reconciliation having to be used in order to get things passed. And these shifts has not only affected the efficiency and productivity of Congress, but also its public perception and the stability of policy implementation, as major legislative achievements are increasingly vulnerable to reversal or undermining with changes in political power. For example, Trump came in and tried to overturn the Affordable Care Act. He was not able to do so, partly because of the shift to divided government and because key moderates in the Republican Party in the Senate refused to back him, including Mitt Romney. And I think this shows how increasing polarization, increasing partisanship results in a kind of less stable legislative environment, and a kind of impacts Congress' legislative function and oversight function, and in many ways makes it less effective. It means that it carries out its roles and its powers less effectively. So moving on to foreign policy and the president's role in it. Effectively, in recent decades, the increasing importance of foreign policy and the expanding role of the president in directing it have notably impacted the changing roles and powers of Congress and their relative importance. So as global challenges and international relations have become more complex and immediate, the president has assumed a more dominant role in foreign policy. And this shift is partly due to the need for swift and decisive action in international affairs, which the executive branch is more structurally suited to provide. And as a result, while Congress retains significant foreign policy powers, such as the ratification of treaties and the oversight of military actions, its role has evolved and in reality become less important. There's been a tendency for Congress to defer more to the executive in critical areas, such as the use of military force, whilst focusing its efforts on areas where it can exert influence, such as using the power of the purse and funding and legislation. And this is also a response to the increased use of executive agreements, military engagements without formal declarations of war, and emergency declarations by presidents. And these are all ways in which, in relation to foreign policy, the president has effectively circumvented Congress and gained more power themselves. For much more detail on foreign policy, as I've kind of said in the notes here, there is going to be, as part of the presidency topic, a whole video on foreign policy, which is going to look at the kind of comparative powers of the Congress and the president in foreign policy. Okay, next key topic to have a look at is the changing significance of the parties in Congress. So in the past few decades, the significance of political parties has undergone notable changes, reflecting broader shifts in the American political landscape. And these changes are characterized by increased polarization, stronger party discipline, and changing dynamics in the legislative process as a result. So, first looking at increased polarization and party unity. So since the 20th century, there's been a big increase in partisan polarization within Congress. So the ideological overlap between the Democrats and Republicans is diminished significantly, with members increasingly adhering to their kind of respective ideological lines and fewer moderates in Congress. This polarization is evident in voting patterns. So cross-party collaborations used to be pretty common, but they've become less common compared to earlier decades. And this is a result of a more divided Congress where compromise and bipartisanship are challenging to achieve. And this is evident in the declining number of moderate or crossover votes in Congress. So there was near universal Republican opposition to the Affordable Care Act and universal Democratic opposition to the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, with effectively almost no one switching to the other side or voting for it when it wasn't. So voting for the Affordable Care Act if you're a Republican, and voting for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act if you're a Democrat. And this can also be seen in the fact that on January the 6th, 8 Republican lawmakers and 139 Republican members of the House of Representatives, so nearly 2/3 of House Republicans, objected to the certification of the 2020 presidential election results in key states, despite there being no evidence of widespread electoral fraud that was claimed by Trump. So the fact that these 147 lawmakers, Republican lawmakers, supported Trump's false accusations, which they knew were false, which objectively and clearly threatened democracy, despite there being no evidence, shows how party loyalty and the pressure they felt from Trump and Republican voters to follow Trump's partisan narrative and agenda was really powerful, and just the increasing importance of polarization in US politics. So it shows that this is really challenging the functioning of Congress and American democracy, but also how parties are effectively increasingly being influenced by their ideological extremes, and that's forcing lawmakers to not compromise with the other party and not be moderates, and effectively forcing them to the ideological extremes and adhering by the party line. You've also seen stronger party discipline. So party leaders such as the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader has gained more control over the members, influencing legislative agendas and voting behaviours. So in 2021, Liz Cheney, a Republican House member, was removed from her leadership position as the House Republican Conference Chair due to her public disagreement with Trump's claims about the 2020 election. And this shows how strengthened party discipline and the party's willingness to enforce uniformity in viewpoints have resulted in the increasing importance of parties in Congress. And this can be attributed to various factors, including the centralization of funding efforts and the strategic use of committee assignments as incentives or punishments, and is linked to this increasing polarization and unity or enforcement of unity within the party. And this has implications for the legislative process, often leading to a more top-down approach in decision-making and policy formulation. So party leaders increasingly dictate legislative agendas and member behaviour. So in 2021, House Democrats uniformly voted to pass the American Rescue Plan, a major COVID-19 relief package, despite internal differences over certain provisions. And this shows how the Democratic leadership has become a lot more effective in unifying the party for a critical legislative goal. Next key thing to have a look at is changes in legislative strategy. So with the more polarised political environment, there's been a tendency for more major legislation to be passed with little or no support from the opposing party, and this has effectively been a strategy. Because it's unlikely you're going to get support from the other party, you effectively have to find legislative efforts that your whole party can unify behind, as seen in the Affordable Care Act and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And the use of budget reconciliation by Republicans to pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and by Democrats to pass the American Rescue Act demonstrates the evolving legislative strategies to circumvent bipartisan negotiation processes, not focusing on this bipartisan compromise, instead focusing on unifying your party. So budget reconciliation is a legislative process originally intended to allow Congress to quickly adjust spending and revenue levels to align with the budget resolution. And crucially, it bypasses the Senate filibuster, meaning that a bill can pass with a simple majority of 51 votes instead of the 60 votes required to close debate through a cloture motion. So this shows they've been using this because they can't get to that 60, so they have to use budget reconciliation, effectively unite one party behind a key piece of legislation in relation to the economy. So during these periods of intense partisanship, and it's all influenced by this polarization and partisanship, this has been increasingly attractive using budget reconciliation to the majority party, which wishes to advance its agenda without the need for bipartisan support. And the final thing we're going to have a quick look at is its impact on governance. So these changes in party dynamics have had a profound impact on the governance and effectiveness of Congress. So increased polarization and strong party discipline have often led to legislative gridlock, with the kind of stalling of policy initiatives due to partisan disagreements. And this can be seen in the 2018 government shutdown and the repeated inability of Congress to agree on comprehensive immigration reform, for example. The gridlock can also lead to a reliance on executive actions by the president, as they know they're unlikely to be able to get much done through Congress if they can't get the parties to work together. For example, after failing to get Congress to pass legislation to implement its border wall on the US-Mexico border, Trump built as much of the wall as possible through emergency actions and executive orders. And it's also worth noting that the heightened partisanship in Congress can also affect public trust, with the perception that party interests often take precedence over national interests. Okay, and the final thing we're going to have a quick look at before we have a look at the final debates is increased gridlock in Congress, which we've touched on a little bit before, but it's effectively become a defining characteristic of the American political landscape and how Congress is viewed. And this gridlock, often a result of intense partisanship and ideological divides, has led to a stagnation in significant legislative actions and a growing reliance on executive powers. So what are the root causes of gridlock? So there's both structural and political factors. So the increased polarization is a primary driver. And this isn't just like political, ideological, it also reflects deep divisions in social and cultural issues in society and increasing polarization across US society, which then impacts politics and makes compromise increasingly difficult. There's actually increased hatred from each side to the other side as well. The primary election system has also contributed to this divide, as it encourages the election of more ideologically extreme candidates who are less inclined to bipartisan cooperation. So you've seen is that through primaries, you've had ideologically extreme or more extreme members of each party unseating moderates. And when there's less moderates in Congress as a result, that makes compromise a lot more difficult and leads to gridlock, particularly under divided government. So you've seen that with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's more over to the left wing of the Democrat Party, being elected through a primary in New York in 2018, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's probably the furthest right Republican in Congress at the moment, was also elected through a primary in Georgia, where she challenged a more moderate candidate. Further, so that's kind of, you've got the kind of cultural causes, the polarization and partisanship. You also got these structural causes, and the final key structural cause is the filibuster, which has become a key tool for the minority party to block legislation, which contributes to further legislative stalemate. So in 2021, Democrats with a slim majority in the Senate were impeded from passing the For the People Act, which is a key piece of legislation intended to expand voting rights, because the filibuster was used by Republicans. In terms of the impact of gridlock, it affects various aspects of governance and public policy. So the first key one is that key legislation on matters such as immigration reform, gun control, and climate change have been stalled or blocked. So the Affordable Care Act is an example of major legislation that faced intense partisan opposition and numerous attempts at repeal after it was passed. And the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed with little bipartisan support. So you see, legislation is rarely passed with bipartisan support now, if it is passed. And so when legislation is passed, it's without bipartisan support, and the lack of the increasing partisanship effectively results in gridlock as well, with a number of key piece of legislation not being passed, and as a result, the president using executive orders and executive actions instead to pursue their agendas. So Donald Trump extensively used executive orders to implement significant policy changes which Congress refused to impose themselves, such as the travel ban targeting several predominantly Muslim countries, and bypassing Congress to advance his immigration agenda with the border wall. And Biden relied on the executive actions early in his term as well, signing a record number of executive orders, including rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, which he wouldn't have been able to get through Congress, as a treaty through the Senate, and reversing Trump-era policies, including restating many environmental protections. It's worth noting, however, that in recent years there have been a number of instances where Congress has been able to overcome gridlock to pass significant legislation driven by urgent circumstances, strong party discipline, and successful cooperation between the parties for some votes. So sometimes they've been able to pass things through strong party discipline, as I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier with kind of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Affordable Care Act, but sometimes it's been through cooperation. An example of when it's been through strong party discipline and effectively getting all of your members of the party to vote for it under unified government so you don't need votes from the other party is the American Rescue Act, which was passed in 2021 with a vote of 220 to 211 in the House and 50 to 49 in the Senate, receiving no Republican votes but unified Democratic support, and when that addressed pandemic-related needs like stimulus checks and vaccine distribution. But you also see some areas of cooperation. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a $1.2 trillion bill, passed with bipartisan Senate support of 69 to 30 and a House vote of 228 to 206, with 19 Senate Republicans and 13 House Republicans joining Democrats in order to pass the bill. And finally, there are some areas of policy and some pieces of legislation which have really strong bipartisan support from both of the parties. So the National Defense Authorization Act, which incorporates significant cybersecurity measures in response to the SolarWinds attack, passed Congress with broad bipartisan support. So a Senate vote of 84 to 13 and a House vote of 335 to 78. It showed the kind of real strong cross-party support in some areas, such as national security. Okay, the final thing we're going to have a look at is the significance and effectiveness of the powers outlined in the Constitution. So as I said here in the notes, arguments on the detail of lawmaking, oversight and representation, and the key arguments on either side are in much more detail in the other Congress videos, so make sure to have a look at those as well. But what we're going to have a look at is in relation to power of the purse, power of appointments, and foreign policy powers, so the ones not covered in the other videos. So first looking at power of the purse, and the arguments that Congress's power of the purse is significant and effective, is that it gives them a fundamental check on the executive branch, ensuring democratic accountability and oversight in financial matters. For example, Congress uses power to effectively pass the CARES Act in 2020, a substantial financial package addressing the economic fallout of COVID-19, and Congress also controls military spending, as seen in the annual National Defense Authorization Act, which sets defensive budgets and policies, illustrating its role in shaping defense strategies and foreign policy to some extent. So it allows Congress to influence domestic and foreign policy by funding or defunding programs, agencies, or initiatives, which makes it a crucial tool in guiding the nation's priorities and values and really checking the president. On the other hand, in recent years, the power of the purse has been undermined by increasing executive actions such as emergency declarations and executive orders, which allow the president to redirect funds without congressional approval. A key example of this is Trump's redirection of military funds for the border wall construction, despite Congress's initial refusal to allocate funds for it. So that's where Congress used its power of the purse to prevent Trump from doing something. In a way, he got around it to some extent by funding it through redirecting funds, though it must be noted that he wasn't able to build his full border wall, which he needed congressional legislation to pass, or to pass congressional legislation in order to achieve that. The frequent use of continuing resolutions instead of passing proper budgets reflects Congress' diminished role in detailed fiscal planning, often resulting in last-minute stopgap measures rather than well-considered budgetary decisions. And you see this with the budgets that are often going right down to the wire, or there being government shutdowns. And additionally, mandatory spending on programs like Social Security and Medicare, which are not annually adjusted by Congress, constitute a large proportion of the federal budget, significantly reducing the scope of congressional discretion in federal spending decisions. So a lot of where spending has gone is kind of already determined each year. Okay, so moving on to the power of appointments. On the one hand, it can be argued that Congress's power of appointments is significant and effective. So its authority to confirm presidential appointments, particularly for positions like Supreme Court justices, federal judges, and cabinet members, can be seen as a vital check on the executive branch, ensuring a balance of power in government. For example, Reagan's Supreme Court nominee Robert Bork was rejected in 1987, which shows how Congress can prevent the appointment of individuals deemed unfit or overly partisan for critical roles. Further, through their hearings and vetting processes, Congress ensures that appointees are qualified and adhere to the standards of ethics and impartiality. So in the 2020 confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett, Congress rigorously examined her previous judicial decisions, particularly on healthcare and abortion, and questioned her views on constitutional issues, therefore ensuring her adherence to key legal standards and ethical principles that's required for a Supreme Court appointment. And crucially, this power allows Congress to influence the long-term direction of the federal judiciary and therefore have an impact on policy. So, for example, the election of three or appointment of three conservative justices under the Trump administration by the Senate resulted in a policy impact, in particular the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022. In terms of arguments that Congress's power over appointments isn't significant and effective, the increasing partisanship in Congress has led to more contentious and politically driven confirmation processes, often hindering the kind of timely appointment of qualified candidates and leaving key positions vacant. I've just talked about this a few times in the video, but the key example for this is Merrick Garland in 2016. In some cases, presidents also circumvent this power by appointing acting officials or using recess appointments, which we'll have a look at in more detail in the presidency videos. And finally, the focus on political loyalty rather than qualifications in confirmation debates can lead to the erosion of professionalism and expertise in government, undermining the effectiveness of federal agencies and courts. So it can be argued that because the appointments from the presidency and when confirming them, especially when there's unified government by the same party, it's often more focused on, okay, what are their political leanings? It's increasingly focused on what are their political leanings rather than whether they're competent. And finally, we'll have a quick look at foreign policy powers. As I've said a number of times in the video, there'll be much more detail in the kind of presidency lesson on foreign policy, which will compare the presidency and Congress and their foreign policy powers. In terms of arguments that their powers are significant and effective, Congress's power to declare war shows its crucial role in shaping the nation's military engagements. The Wars Powers Resolution was designed to check the president's power to commit forces in an armed conflict without congressional consent, and in some ways can be seen as having been effective. Congress can also exercise significant influence over foreign policy through the power of the purse, and the ratification of international treaties, such as the New START Treaty with Russia, requires Senate approval, therefore giving Congress a direct role in formalising significant international agreements and partnerships. In terms of arguments that Congress's foreign policy powers aren't significant and effective, the increasing use of executive orders and military actions without explicit congressional authorization by the president highlights a decline in Congress's role in governing military engagements and effectively less powers of oversight and the president having greater powers in foreign policy. The failure to repeal or significantly amend the authorization for the use of military force granted after the September 11 attacks, so 9/11, demonstrates Congress's limited effectiveness in reining in executive power, allowing successive presidents to engage in military actions without specific congressional approval. Congress also faces challenges in presenting a unified stance on foreign policy due to partisan divisions, and this can lead to inconsistent or conflicting signals to international allies and adversaries. And finally, the executive branch, through the Department of State and President's role as Commander-in-Chief, often takes the lead in foreign policy and really limits Congress's effectiveness and role in this area, which relegates Congress to more of a reactive rather than a proactive role. And it must also be noted that the War Powers Resolution in many ways hasn't been effective in reining in presidential power over foreign policy. So yeah, that's everything in relation to the interpretations and debates around Congress, and that's the final Congress video. Let me know if you've got any questions or comments in the comment section below, and I'll be back soon with videos on the presidency.